The stars outside the viewport did not care who was watching them. They burned the same, whether a 1,000-year-old dragon elder stared at them or a 2-year-old hatchling pressed her snout against the cold glass and fogged it with her breath. Sorrel did not know this yet. She only knew that the lights were very far away and that the tall human who sat at the glowing desk every night seemed to understand them. She had been placed aboard the research vessel Ardent 11 months ago. The Conclave elders called it a diplomatic gesture. The human crew called it a cultural exchange. Nobody called it what it actually was. The Conclave sending a hatchling somewhere out of the way so the adults could hold their meetings in peace. Sorrel was small, even for her age. Golden-green scales, still soft at the edges where they had not fully hardened. Eyes too large for her face. Claws that clicked on the metal floor when she walked, which she did often, wandering the corridors of the Ardent with no particular purpose because no one expected her to have one. Hatchlings did not learn. Everyone knew this. The first time she wandered into the research bay, Davan did not look up from his console. He was a quiet man, somewhere in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers and the habit of talking to himself when he worked. He narrated his own thinking out loud, not for anyone's benefit, just to keep the thoughts from slipping away. Spectral Class G, luminosity moderate, probably 4 billion years old. See the calcium lines here? That is the star's way of telling us what it is made of. Stars talk in light. You just have to know what you are listening for. He paused, looked up. Sorrel was sitting 3 feet away, head tilted, eyes fixed on the display. He assumed she had followed the warmth of the console. The research bay ran cooler than the rest of the ship, and hatchlings liked warmth. He nodded at her, said nothing more, and went back to his charts. She came back the next night. And the night after that. He kept talking because silence felt strange and she was a decent audience. He told her about spectral lines and how each element absorbed different wavelengths of light. He explained gravitational signatures and how a star's mass could be calculated from the way it bent the space around it. He showed her color maps of stellar temperature, told her that blue meant hotter and red meant cooler, that white stars were young and violent and red giants were old and slow and enormous. She never moved, she never made a sound, she just watched the display and listened. Around the 3rd week, Davan started bringing 2 mugs of something warm to the research bay, one for himself, one that he placed on the floor near Sorrel because he had noticed she liked to hold warm things in her forepaws while she sat. She never drank from it. She just held it and watched the stars. Wynne, his junior researcher, found this arrangement deeply strange. You know she does not understand any of that, Wynne said one afternoon, nodding toward Sorrel, who was sitting in her usual spot, staring at a star map Davan had left on the secondary display. Probably not, Davan said. Hatchlings do not process complex information. Counselor Orvin said her cognitive development will not begin in earnest for another 8 years at minimum. He might be right. Then why do you keep explaining things to her? Davan thought about it for a moment. Because she keeps showing up, he said. Seems rude not to. Wynne gave him a long look and went back to her work. Sorrel did not react to any of this. She was looking at the secondary display where a cluster of stars was mapped in soft blue and gold. One particular star near the edge of the cluster was marked with a catalog symbol, a string of numbers and letters that meant nothing to anyone except the astronomers who used the system. Davan had explained the notation system 2 weeks ago. He had not thought much of it since. That night, after the rest of the crew had gone to their quarters and the research bay was quiet, Davan noticed something on the floor near the left console. He leaned down and looked. Scratched into the metal, carefully, with the tip of a small claw, was a symbol, not random, not a scratch. It was the catalog notation for the star on the secondary display, imperfect. The angles were slightly wrong, but it was recognizable, unmistakably recognizable. He stood there for a very long time. Sorrel was watching him from across the room. She had not moved. Davan pulled his chair around and sat down in front of her. He picked up a data slate and opened a blank chart page. He held it out toward her. Then slowly, He pointed at the star on the display, then at the scratch on the floor, then back at the display. Sorrel looked at the slate, then at the display, then at Davan. She reached out one small claw and tapped the slate once. Davan exhaled. He set the slate on the floor in front of her, opened the star catalogue to page 1, and pulled his chair close. "All right," he said quietly, "let us start from the beginning." Outside the viewport, the stars kept burning, patient and indifferent. Neither of them slept that night. 14 months passed the way deep space months do, quietly, with no seasons to mark them, only the slow rotation of star charts and the soft hum of the Ardent's engines. In that time, Sorrel grew 3 inches. Her scales hardened along her spine and shoulders, the gold deepening to a richer shade against the green. She stopped clicking when she walked. She had figured out how to place her claws softly, the way one learns to move quietly in a place where others are sleeping, except no one had asked her to. She had simply decided. The research bay had become hers as much as Davan's. She had a specific spot, second console from the left, floor space below it, where she sat, and when someone else used that console, she waited with enormous patience until they were finished. Nobody asked why. After the first few months, nobody even remarked on it. Davan had said nothing to the rest of the crew about what was happening. He told himself it was because he was not yet certain. Every time he prepared to say something, he looked at what they had done together and thought, "No, not yet. Let it be a little more solid first." The truth was, he did not want someone to explain it away before he understood it himself. Sorrel had worked through the full spectral classification system. She understood luminosity classes. She could identify a star's approximate age from its spectral output, correct for interstellar dust when reading color data, and estimate gravitational mass from the curvature signatures in the Ardent scan records. She made her notations in a combination of human catalog shorthand and her own symbols, a private language built on top of a borrowed one. She had also started correcting the existing charts. Small things at first. A binary system logged as a single star because the separation was narrow and the automated scanner had not flagged it. A gravitational drift miscalculation in a cluster survey from 8 years ago that had been copied forward into every subsequent map of the region. A star whose spectral class had been logged incorrectly because the original scan had been taken through a dust cloud and nobody had applied the correction factor. Davan verified each one. Every correction was right. He had started keeping a separate log, password protected, labeled only with her name. Wynne found it on a Tuesday. Not the protected log, the charts. Sorrel had been working on a star map of 3 adjacent clusters using a data slate Davan had configured for her, and she had left it on the secondary console when she went to find him for their evening session. Wynne picked it up, expecting a blank screen or perhaps some accidental input. Instead, she found a complete cartographic survey with margin notes in broken human script. She stood there for 4 full minutes before she set the slate down and went to find Davan. The conversation that followed was not angry, it was quieter than that, which was in some ways harder. Wynne was a precise person, and she stood very still while Davan explained, and when he finished, she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "How long?" 14 months. And you said nothing. I was not sure what I was looking at, he said, and then I was sure, and I still did not know who would believe it. Wynne looked at the data slate in her hand, then at the wall of the corridor, as if she could see through it to the research bay where Sorrel was waiting. "She is 2 years old," Wynne said. "Almost 3 now. Davan, she is a hatchling. I know what she is." There was another long pause. Then Wynne said, "Show me everything," and that was the end of the argument. The 3 of them worked together after that. Wynne brought structure to what Davan had been doing on instinct, proper evaluation methods, documented sessions, verified results. Sorrel adapted to the change without complaint. She simply observed Wynne the way she had once observed Davan, and within 2 weeks began predicting what Wynne was about to ask for before she asked. Counselor Orvin found out on a Thursday. He had been informed by one of the human officers, not Davan, not Wynne, but someone who had heard something and felt the Dragon Elder should know. Orvin came to the research bay that evening with the expression of a creature who had already decided what he was going to find. He watched Sorrel work for 20 minutes. Then he said carefully that hatchlings sometimes mimicked complex behavior. It was instinct dressed as intelligence, well documented. It did not mean what it appeared to mean. Davan said nothing. He turned to the main display and pulled up the corrected charts, the binary system, the drift miscalculation, the spectral error, and 11 others that Sorrel had flagged in the past 3 months. He placed his corrected versions beside the originals. He placed Sorrel's versions beside his. They were the same. In several cases, Sorrel's corrections were more precise. Orvin looked at the display for a long time. He said nothing. Something shifted in his posture, not quite a flinch, but close to one. It was in that silence that Sorrel walked to the main display and picked up the stylus from the tray below it. She navigated the chart herself, moving through the outer veil region they had been mapping for the past week, scrolling slowly through the field of catalogued stars. Then she stopped. She stared at a single point in the star field, just stared for nearly a full minute, completely still. Then she placed the stylus against the display and drew a small, careful spiral beside one star, a symbol not found in any human or dragon notation system. A symbol that was hers, meaning something only she had decided it meant. She set the stylus down. She looked at Davan. "This one," she said, in clear human speech, the first words she had ever spoken in that language, "is wrong." In the corner of the room, Counselor Orvin sat down very slowly in a chair that was too small for him. Nobody pointed this out. The star had a catalogue number. It had coordinates. It had a recorded spectral class and a logged luminosity rating. On every display aboard the Ardent, it looked like exactly what it was supposed to look like. A quiet, mid-sequence yellow star in a sparse region of the outer veil, the kind of star that filled the galaxy in the billions, noticed by no one because there was nothing to notice. Davan ran the first scan at midnight, alone, because he wanted to look at the data before anyone else could tell him what it meant. The passive scan came back clean, temperature within normal range, luminosity normal, spectral output matched its logged classification exactly. He almost stopped there. Then he checked the variance logs, the natural fluctuation in a star's output, the tiny constant breathing of energy that every star produced because stars were not machines. They flickered, slightly, constantly, in patterns driven by internal pressure cycles and magnetic activity. This star did not flicker. Not a little, not within a margin. The output line on the variance chart was flat, perfectly, completely, impossibly flat. Stars did not do that. A perfectly stable output meant the star's energy production was being regulated somehow from the inside or the outside in a way that had no natural explanation. Davan sat with that for a while. Then he pulled the gravitational profile. The star's mass was logged at approximately 1 solar mass, standard for its type, but the gravitational influence it exerted on the surrounding space was roughly 1.4 times what that mass should produce. It was not dramatic enough to have triggered any automated alert. The survey ships that had mapped this region would have noted the reading, logged it as a minor instrument variance, and moved on. He went looking for the original survey records. There were 3 of them, scans taken by different vessels over the past 80 years. The star appeared in all 3. He went deeper into the pre-human archives, the conclave mapping records that the Ardent carried for reference. He searched 200 years back, then 500, then 1,000. The star was not there. He searched the Galactic Survey Consortium database, which compiled records from 6 elder civilizations going back over 1 million years. This region had been mapped repeatedly. The star was absent from every record older than approximately 900 years. A star had appeared in the outer veil, unannounced, between 900 and 1,200 years ago, and in all the time since, no one had thought to ask why. Because it looked normal, because it was easy to assume it had simply been missed in earlier surveys, because nobody expected a star to be placed somewhere by someone. Davin did not sleep. By morning he had called Wynne, and by midday they had both called Councillor Orvin, and by evening the three of them were sitting in the research bay with the full data spread across every display, and the room was very quiet. Orvin said he would consult the Conclave archives personally. He spent 4 hours doing so via secure long-range communication. When he returned to the research bay, he sat down in the chair that was too small for him again and said nothing for a while. His scales, usually held flat and smooth, were raised slightly at the neck, a dragon's unconscious response to something it found deeply unsettling. "It is not in our records," he said finally. "Not in any form, not as an anomaly, not as an unexplained addition. It simply does not exist in anything the Conclave has ever charted." Wynne said, "Then where did it come from?" No one answered. The report went up the chain. Admiral Ressa received it 6 hours later via relay, read it twice, and authorized a deep scan mission immediately. She also, without explaining herself to anyone below her rank, quietly rerouted a military corvette toward the outer veil. She noted in her private log that the situation did not feel threatening. It felt significant. Those were different things, and she had learned, over 30 years of service, never to confuse them. Elder Thurak contacted the Ardent the following morning. Thurak was one of the senior members of the Draconic Conclave, older than Orvin by several centuries, with a reputation for having seen everything twice and being unimpressed by most of it. He had been notified through Conclave channels, and he was, as Wynne later described it to Davan, aggressively calm about the whole thing. He said it was a mapping error. He said these things happened when junior researchers became excited about minor anomalies. He said the Ardent should log its findings and move on to the next survey region. He said this 3 times in slightly different words. His face on the communication screen was absolutely still. "He is afraid," Sorrel said from her spot on the floor. Everyone looked at her. She had been silent through the entire transmission. She was watching the screen even though Thurak had signed off already. "He knows something," she said. "He wants us to leave before we find out what it is." Orvin opened his mouth, closed it again. Davan said, "We are not leaving." He said it simply, without heat, like a statement of geography. They activated the deep scan array at the start of the night cycle. It was the Ardent's most powerful sensor system, designed for exactly this kind of detailed stellar examination. The active pulse would reach the star's coordinates in 40 minutes. They waited. At minute 42, every alarm on the ship went off at once. Not from the star itself, from the space around it. The deep scan had found something that no passive observation ever could. Surrounding the star, arranged in a formation that was too precise to be accidental, too large to have been missed by anything less than a full active scan, were structures. Davan looked at the readout, then he looked at Sorrel. She was not looking at the readout. She was looking out the viewport toward the distant point of light that was the star, and her expression was something he had never seen on a dragon's face before. Not fear, not surprise. Something quieter than both. Something that looked, strangely, like the face of someone hearing a familiar sound from very far away. Silence on a ship in crisis has a particular texture. It is not the silence of empty rooms. It is the silence of people who are breathing carefully, moving carefully, saying only what is necessary, because every unnecessary word feels like something that could go wrong. The Ardent held that silence for 90 seconds after the alarms stopped. Davan was the first to speak. He read from the scan display in a flat, even voice, the way a person reads when they are determined not to let the numbers frighten them before they have finished counting. "Structures," he said, "geometric arrangement, equidistant spacing, material composition unknown." The scanner did not have a reference category for what it was detecting. Scale was difficult to establish from this distance, but preliminary estimates suggested each structure was larger than anything the Ardent had been built to imagine as a single object. Wynne pulled up the visual enhancement filter and applied it to the scan data. The structures did not show on any optical channel. They were invisible to light. They existed only in the deep scan data, shapes defined by what they did to the space around them rather than what they looked like. They are arranged around the star, Wynne said, not near it, around it. Orvain stood at the back of the room and said nothing. His breathing was audible. Admiral Ressa was on open channel within 4 minutes of the alarms. Her corvette was still hours away, held at the edge of the region by a technical pretense she had invented to justify proximity without triggering diplomatic complications. She listened to Davan's readout without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Weapons status. None of ours active, nothing from them either. Keep it that way, keep the channel open, tell me everything as it happens." "Understood. And Davan, do not do anything brave." He said he would try. The scan of the Ardent began 11 minutes after initial contact. It was not like being scanned by a custom sensor or a military sweep. Those were blunt things, energy washes that checked for mass and material. This was precise, methodical. It moved across the hull in slow, overlapping passes, and the Ardent sensor logs recorded it in detail, a coherent energy pattern, not random, not aggressive, but examining. The way a careful hand moves over an object in the dark to understand its shape. The crew felt it, not physically, the hull was not touched, but the sensors showed it clearly enough that standing on the bridge felt different from standing on the bridge 5 minutes ago. The scan passed over every crew member. The biological sensors registered it as a low-intensity energy interaction, harmless, but it tracked individuals. Davan knew this because the scan returned to certain people twice. It returned to him twice. It returned to Orvain 3 times. It returned to Sorrel 11 times. Wynne caught this in the data and said, very quietly, "It keeps coming back to her." Sorrel had not moved from her place near the viewport. She had not reacted to the alarms, had not moved to a console, had not asked anyone what was happening. She simply stood and watched the point of light that was the star, still impossibly steady, still perfectly flat in its output, and she looked, to Davan, like someone listening to music he could not hear. "Sorrel," he said. She turned. "The scan, it is focused on you. Do you feel it?" She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Yes." "What does it feel like?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Like being asked something," she said, "but I do not know what." The scan completed its pass and paused. Then slowly, it changed. The energy pattern shifted, not in intensity, but in structure. It became something different, more deliberate. The sensor logs showed it moving across the hull in a new sequence, no longer examining, now repeating a specific pattern. The same sequence of pulses, over and over, arriving at the hull in the same order each time. "It is signaling," Davan said. Nobody disagreed. He looked at Sorrel. Sorrel looked at the viewport. Then she walked to the hull sensor panel. She placed one claw against the surface, gently, not a command, not a demand, just a placement, a response. And she drew, slowly and carefully, the same spiral she had marked on the star chart weeks ago. The sensor panel was not a drawing surface. Her claw left no mark. But the energy pattern outside changed immediately. The repeating pulse sequence stopped. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then the pattern returned, and embedded within it, unmistakably, was a shape that matched the spiral. Not perfectly, not a clean copy, but a response. Something outside had taken the gesture and reflected it back. Ressa, still on open channel, said nothing for a moment. Then, did that just work? "Yes," Davan said. Another pause. Then Ressa, and he would remember this for the rest of his life, made a short sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something much older than a laugh. "All right then," she said, "keep going." A transmission arrived 14 minutes later. It was not sound. It was not text. It was a structured data pattern delivered through the same energy channel as the scan, dense, layered, clearly organized, clearly meaningful, and entirely unlike anything in the Ardent's language database. Davan copied the full transmission to every analysis system the ship had. None of them returned anything useful. He looked at Sorrel. She was already sitting on the floor with a data slate, eyes half closed, the stylus moving slowly. She was not translating yet. She was listening. She had told him once, early in their work together, that the hardest part of reading a star was not learning the symbols. It was learning to stop expecting the star to speak in a language you already knew. He sat beside her. He opened his own slate. He waited. It took 3 hours. What they had at the end was incomplete, partial, and uncertain. Some words had no equivalent in any language either of them knew, but the structure of the message was clear enough. It was a question, repeated across multiple layers of the transmission, phrased in slightly different ways each time, as if the sender was not sure which form would translate. It said roughly, "You are early. How did you find us?" Davan read the translation twice. He looked at Sorrel. She looked back at him with those 2 large golden eyes, calm as the stars outside, and he understood in that moment that this had never really been about the star. It had always been about her. Gravity is patient. It does not announce itself. It simply holds. The Ardent stopped moving toward the star at some point during the 3rd hour of translation work, and nobody noticed until Wynne checked the navigation panel and found that the ship's engines were running normally, producing thrust, and the ship was completely stationary. No alarm, no collision, no visible force. The vessel was simply being kept in place by something that did not need to explain itself. Resser's corvette reported the same thing 40 minutes later, held at the edge of the region as precisely as a pin in a map. "Is it hostile?" Resser asked. Davan checked every sensor reading available. No damage, no energy build, no targeting signatures. The hull is fine, the crew is fine, the engines are fine. "But we are not moving. We are not moving." Resser was quiet for a moment. "Then we stay calm and we keep working," she said. "Whatever is holding us, it has had more than enough time to do something worse if it wanted to." This was, Davan thought, why Resser had her rank, not because she had never been afraid, but because she never let fear become the loudest voice in the room. The translation work continued through the night. Sorrel worked without stopping. Davan worked beside her, writing down everything she produced, asking questions when a word had no clear equivalent, finding the closest human concept, and marking it uncertain in the notes. Wynne managed the sensor logs and kept Resser updated on the hour. By dawn, they had enough. The entities, they used no name that could be translated, referred to the star as the record. Not a star in the sense of a burning natural object, though it burned, and it was natural enough in most of its function. It had been constructed around an existing stellar core, reinforced, stabilized, its output regulated to remove variance. It had been placed in the outer veil, in a region that multiple civilizations had mapped and would continue to map over thousands of years as a test. Not a test of military strength, not a test of technology. A test of perception. A species advanced enough to have precise stellar cartography would eventually accumulate enough data over enough centuries that the inconsistencies in the record star would become visible. The missing variance, the gravitational discrepancy, the absence from pre-insertion archives, not visible in a single scan, not visible in a decade of observation, visible only in the long accumulation of careful, detailed, repeated work, the kind of work done by a civilization that had decided the universe was worth understanding. The entities had placed similar records in 43 other locations across the galaxy. Not one had ever been found. Not the Conclave, across 11,000 years of stellar observation, not the Galactic Survey Consortium with its million-year archive, not the 6 elder civilizations whose mapping records predated every species currently alive. No one had looked at those stars and said, "This one is wrong." Until Sorrel. Orvain received this information sitting in his undersized chair, and he sat with it for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was even and quiet, which Davin had come to understand, was how dragons sounded when they were experiencing something they had not prepared themselves for. She should not have been able to do this, Orvin said. Not at her age, not at any age below full cognitive maturity. And yet, Davin said. And yet, Orvin looked at Sorrel, who was still working on the secondary transmissions, cross-referencing the entity's signal grammar against patterns she had built up in her own notation system. The Conclave has a word, he said. We consider it myth. A hatchling who develops before their time, who learns in the dormancy period, who sees before the eyes are supposed to open. We call them Sorlane. Davan looked at him. That is her name. I know, Orvin's voice was not quite steady. Her parents named her before she was born. It was considered sentimental, a hope, not a prediction. He paused. It has not been spoken as a true thing in 11,000 years. Through the communication relay, on Ressa's corvette, someone had apparently heard this and told the Admiral, because Ressa's voice came through a few minutes later. What does it mean? She asked. The word, what does it translate to? Orvin answered her directly, which was not something he had done before in all their weeks of working together. The one who grows in winter, he said, a mind that opens before its season. There was a brief silence on the relay. Then Ressa said, that is a good name. Elder Thurak sent a communication request during the 6th hour. Davan authorized it, and Thurak appeared on screen looking composed in the way that is only possible through considerable effort. He began to say that the findings needed to be reviewed by the full conclave before any further action was taken. He said this situation was too significant for a single research vessel to manage. He said, carefully, that Sorrel's involvement needed to be evaluated by elder specialists who could properly assess her development. He did not say what they had all understood, since Sorrel identified his fear 2 days ago, that Thurak knew something about the records, or knew something about what finding them would mean, and he had been afraid of exactly this outcome, for reasons he was not prepared to share. Sorrel looked up from her work and met Thurak's eyes through the screen. She said nothing. She simply looked at him for 5 seconds, then went back to the translation. Thurak cut the communication himself without completing the sentence he had started. He did not contact them again. The entities sent a longer transmission in the 7th hour, more complex, better calibrated to the grammatical framework Sorrel had developed. She worked through it carefully while the rest of the ship crew waited in the corridor outside the research bay, most of them having given up any pretense of returning to their duties. When Sorrel finished, she set the stylus down and sat still for a moment, the way she did when she was deciding how to say something precisely. Then she looked at Davan. They have been watching, she said. A long time. They tried to help once long before any of us existed. It went wrong, so now they only watch. They keep records, they wait. She paused. They did not expect anyone to find them yet. They say their lowest estimate was another 100,000 years. Davan let that sit for a moment. What changed their estimate? He asked. Sorrel tilted her head slightly. Me, she said. They say I found it the wrong way. The way someone finds a thing when they do not know what they are not supposed to see. From the corridor, someone made a quiet sound that was not quite a word. Then the holding force released. The Ardent's navigation panel showed clear thrust response. Ressa's corvette reported the same. The structures had not moved. The star had not changed. But the channel was open, and the next transmission was already arriving. Sorrel picked up the stylus before Davan said a word. She looked at him over her shoulder, golden eyes bright, and said, "They want to show us the others." There is a certain kind of awe that does not make noise. It does not gasp. It does not shout. It sits very still in the chest and watches because it understands correctly that moving too quickly might break whatever is being witnessed. That was the awe aboard the Ardent as it was guided inward. Structures revealed themselves gradually, the way distant mountains appear on approach, first as suggestions, then as shapes, then as things so large that the eye struggles to assign them a frame of reference. They were not silver or gold or any color that suggested warmth. They were the color of deep space made solid, as if someone had taken the material of the void and given it geometry, clean angles, vast curves, surfaces that did not reflect light so much as hold it briefly before letting it go. The Ardent moved through them slowly. Ressa's corvette followed 50 kilometers behind, running silent, her crew watching through every sensor they had. Nobody spoke on the bridge for a long time. The entities communicated through the energy channel continuously now, and Sorrel translated in real time, her voice low and careful. The structures were not a station, they were not a weapon, they were not a home. They were an archive, the physical record of 43,000 years of observation, preserved in material that did not decay, in formats that did not require power to maintain, built around an artificial star, so that any civilization advanced enough to find the wrong thing would also be advanced enough to understand what they were looking at. 43 records scattered across the galaxy, 43 stars that should not exist, each one placed in a region mapped by multiple civilizations, each one waiting. The entities showed them the map. Davan looked at it for a long time. He recognized 3 of the record stars immediately. They were in regions the Ardent had surveyed in the past 2 years. Stars he had looked at, stars he had logged, stars he had never questioned because they looked exactly like what they were supposed to look like. He said quietly, "We walked right past them." "Yes," Sorrel said, then translating, "Every species has until now." Orvain stood beside Davan and looked at the map, and his expression was the expression of someone revising every assumption they had carried for a very long time. He did it without protest. He did it the way the honest ones always did, by simply accepting the new information and adjusting the picture. "I owe her an apology," he said. Davan looked at him. "When she first began learning, I told you it was mimicry." He kept looking at the map. "I knew even then that I was not entirely sure. I chose certainty because uncertainty was more uncomfortable." He paused. "That was not wisdom, that was habit." Davan said nothing. The apology was not for him. Orvain turned to Sorrel and spoke in formal conclave tone, the register used for significant declarations, the one that carried weight across centuries. He said her name. He said the word Sorlane. He said that the conclave had not spoken it in earnest in 11,000 years, and that he was speaking it now as a true thing, witnessed, on record. Sorrel looked at him for a moment. Then she dipped her head once, the way young dragons acknowledge elders when they are being respectful. It was a small gesture. It was enough. Ressa's voice came through the relay. "I am putting all of this in the report," she said. "Every word, the whole thing. And I want it on record that a hatchling who was told she could not learn just made first contact with the oldest intelligence we have ever encountered." A pause. "Someone at command is going to have a very bad day reading this, and I find I do not mind that at all." Davan sat down at his console and opened a new document. He was not sure who the report was for. Ressa had her own, the conclave would write its own, the consortium would compile its own. But he wanted one that started in the right place. He wrote, "The discovery was not made by our instruments. It was made by a child who was told she could not learn. And a scientist who forgot to stop explaining things to her." He looked at it for a moment, then he kept writing. The entity's final transmission of the day was the longest they had sent. Sorrel worked through it for 2 hours, pausing frequently, asking Davan to hold specific phrase structures while she checked them against the grammar framework she had built. When she finished, she was quiet for longer than usual. "What does it say?" Wynne asked. Sorrel looked at the translation notes spread across the floor around her. Then she looked up. "They want to share the archive," she said. "All of it, everything they have recorded, 43,000 years of observation." She paused. "But they have a condition." The room was very still. "They do not want technology, they do not want territory, they do not want an alliance." She paused again, and her expression was something Davan had never quite seen on her face before, not quite pride, not quite shyness, something sitting carefully between the two. "They want me to teach them." Wynne said, "Teach them what?" "How I learned," Sorrel said. "Not the star system, Not the notation, how I learned it, what it was like to understand something for the first time. They have been watching species for so long that they have forgotten what it is to begin. They say, she checked her notes. They say they have the record of every civilization that has ever reached the stars, but they do not have the record of what it felt like to look up for the first time and decide the lights were worth understanding. The room was quiet. Davan looked at her. She looked back, golden eyes steady and warm and entirely sure of herself in the way she had always been, even when she was a small hatchling sitting beside a console for warmth, listening to a tired scientist talk to himself about spectral lines. "Can you teach that?" he asked. "I do not know," she said, "but I know what it felt like. I remember every part of it." She tilted her head toward him. "You were there for most of it." Outside, through the viewport, the artificial star burned clear and still, the one that should not exist, placed in the dark 1,000 years ago to wait for someone ready to notice it was wrong. Sorrel turned to face the vast and silent archive around them, took a slow breath, and began to explain, in 3 languages at once, what it feels like to see something for the very first time. It sounded, Davan thought, a lot like wonder.